Okay, everyone, thank you for coming again, back from the break. We're going to talk today about advertisement, and we have three great speakers that are going to tell us about what is Haptics doing for advertising these days. And our first speaker is David Birnbaum. He is the director of user design experience at Immersion Corporation. He has a background in music, and he is an inventor as well on different areas related to haptics. And with that, I give the word to Dave.
All right, thank you, Manuel. So today I'm really going to talk about storytelling and how we can use the sense of touch to tell stories. That's what we do in advertising, that's what we do in media, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do with a lot of these different technologies like VR and AR. So I think that there are specific things that touch can do to tell stories that is different from other sensory channels, and so we'll get into a little bit of that. So a little bit about me. So I have this music background, and I can kind of relate to the low felt crew because in my research for my education, I was studying how musicians use the sense of touch to perform, and then how we might incorporate the sense of touch and vibration back into electronic instruments, because electronic instruments don't vibrate, and they don't even have great force feedback in a lot of cases. This limits their ability to play virtuosic music, and so we can kind of, by studying acoustic instruments and traditional instruments, we can kind of reintroduce some of those interaction design concepts, you could say. So that's what led me to haptics, and it blew my mind how important the sense of touch was. This is a short advertisement for a car. Sorry to make you sit through it, but the point of this is that here's a guy in his posh apartment, and he's watching his big screen TV, relaxed, totally focused on the ad. This is what the brand would like, how the brand would like you to experience that car ad, right? But the reality is something a lot more like this. It's, you're lucky if the person even has the sound on. If they do, it's a crappy speaker. And this is even pretty ideal because this person's sitting. Imagine that this person's waiting at a bus stop and it's snowing, and they have children tugging on their coats wanting attention. Like, that's how people are actually going to experience this car ad. So brands, brands who are doing mobile video are well aware of this, that this is not an ideal viewing scenario. And so they're looking for ways to engage people. And I guess the other thing I want to say about mobile video is I often get the question, it's like, well, is it only mobile video? Like, is that really the most important use case? Well, the vast majority of video now is consumed on mobile devices, so we think it is a problem worth solving. Okay, so getting into more like the meat of the talk. So what is going on beneath the surface on a sensory emotional level when people experience haptic media? And how does haptics affect the brains? We did a study on that. We'll talk about some of the data. And then how can you use haptics to tell stories? What are the kind of the design takeaways? Okay, so our world is tactile, and we move through it and we experience objects and really life through the sense of touch. This is something that just can't be overstated. Haptics, there's a million different definitions for it. One of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind is that haptics refers to an activity. You're enacting the world around you as you explore it with your body. You're learning about its contours and its limitations through your body, and so you're creating this map of physical reality around you. To me, that's what haptics really is. And so that leads to these things like it lets you learn about the world through body movement, active exploration. It even creates a belief in external reality. We see this in research on VR. The concept of presence becomes much more, the feeling of presence becomes much more intense when haptics is added to the VR experience. It enables extended proprioception. So here's a person who's blind holding a cane, and they aren't having the experience of feeling the cane. They're having the experience of feeling the ground. So that's profound, because that means that their brain-body map is incorporating this object into itself. So it really is, for all intents and purposes, part of their body. And then it also facilitates affective interactions, meaning kind of emotional, interpersonal interactions. There's a million stories about how important it is to close a business deal, people will fly across the world to shake somebody's hand to close a big deal just because that human connection is necessary for that to take place, even though it's extremely expensive and inconvenient to do it. So that just tells you how incredibly important it is. Babies will suffer and eventually die if they're not held and hugged and have this physical human interaction. So just the fact, I mean, I think we've talked about it like 5 times in this conference, but just the fact that mobile devices are now our primary communication channel and they don't have this rich sense of touch means that our human communication is degrading in quality and in intimacy and in affection. So I think that's a really important area to innovate in. But touch isn't experienced alone. It's rarely to never that you have a touch sensation in isolation, right? It's always incorporated with this multimodality. And so one of the things we think about as haptic designers is not just how to design the haptics, but how to design the entire experience such that the haptics complements the message trying to be gotten across. And this is a homunculus. Interesting as we transition to talking about the brain. So this is a sculpture that has been proportioned such that the body parts are in proportion to the amount of neural processing associated with them. And so this is your user. This is your viewer of that mobile ad. They have an enormous amount of brain attention associated with their hands. Their hands are holding a featureless glass rectangle. Meanwhile, huge amounts of money and production value has been invested in the eyes and the ears, the hands not so much. So I think that there's a real opportunity here. So talking more about the brain. So this is a radical oversimplification for those of you who are into neuroscience, so I apologize. But basically, we're going to talk about the brain as if it has kind of 3 major parts. This reptilian brain that's very old, that's all about survival. This is where your fight or flight instinct comes from when you get startled. This is the oldest part of your brain that comes from back when we were reptiles. Later, the mammalian brain developed, and animals started to be able to interact with members of their own species at a higher level. And so this is part of the brain that starts to become like engaged in social communication, but also in kind of situational awareness and interaction with others. And then finally, the simian brain is where we're creative, we express ourselves, we have these, we can write symphonies, all those sorts of things. So considering this model, I kind of mapped it onto the engagement model for ads. So this is an engagement model for ads. I didn't make it up, that you have to get people's attention with an ad, because if you don't, then they don't even see it. You have to stimulate desire for something, and then you have to give people reasons to want to buy your product. So one example might be, let's say you have an obnoxious banner ad on a website and it's flashing, right? It's super annoying looking, but the reason it is because you were reading something and now you're paying attention to it. So they don't even care that they're being obnoxious. They just want to get past this first gate. And then they might show you images that are enticing, like attractive people or some cute animals, something that makes you stimulates your desire for more interaction. And then they might say, refinance your mortgage or something, right? So now they're giving you like reasons to like go do something. But what's interesting about this is that it's a timeline. And it's a timeline of brain engagement, right? So you have to get their attention, you have to engage their lizard brain, you have to then stimulate desire, and then you have to reinforce with reasons in the simian brain. So this was a nice theory, and we started looking at a journey map of how people interact with not only ads, but then after the ad, what's the purchase decision process? What is their experience of the product after they purchase it? And we realized that brain timeline kind of takes place in stages 1, 2, and 3. It correlates quite nicely, actually. That's a typical journey map. You can see it in many different marketing textbooks. But if you look at the sensory emotional journey map, in other words, if you look at what senses are engaged at these different stages, it looks something like this. So ads are typically visual and audio. Then you see an ad online, so you have a visual audio experience. Then you have this experience of some kind of rich visual and engaging imagery or something like that. You think, I might like that. I want to buy that gizmo. And then you go and you Google it and you start reading reviews. And so then you're researching and evaluating, but you're still, even though you're reading, maybe you're listening to a podcast about the product, you're using your eyes and your ears. Still, you still haven't touched anything. That sensory channel is unused. And then finally, in the case of an in-store purchase at least, you're touching a product. Maybe not. Maybe you're not even touching it yet because you're buying it on Amazon, which is increasingly the case. But let's say it's in store. So you go and touch the product, and you finally know what it feels like. You finally know whether you have all these kind of instinctive understandings. Oh, this feels expensive or cheap. Or, oh, like this is not the right size at all. I was thinking something completely different. And then as you use the product, you might start discovering how reliable it is or how good it feels to continue using it. You start to become attached to it. And so then you're still using kind of these three senses. But what's interesting about the sense of touch is that it results in certain behaviors, right? So if you touch a product in a store, you're more likely to purchase it. That's well established. And so as marketers, marketers really want to know how can we get that experience earlier in the process. So that's kind of what haptic advertising does. Now all of a sudden you have three sensory channels at the very earliest stages of engagement with that brand or that product. So it really is a breakthrough because it's a much richer way to engage people. Okay, so that's a nice theory framework. How does it actually affect the brain? We were curious, so we did a study on kind of the neuromarketing of all of this. We did a study with an EEG. We partnered with an agency that does this type of work a lot. This was a very comfortable interface. It's very high resolution. And what we were measuring were these things. We looked at the heart rate to look at whether the person is feeling exerted. The cognitive load, so that's interesting because if the cognitive load is high, it means they're struggling to understand it. The motivation level, and then the arousal level. So these are all abstractions from the data that our partner presented us with. And we made a timeline here of the sensor readout. So along the top is a storyboard of a short ad that we had people watch. And this black here is the haptic track that we designed to go along with it. And then here we see motivation, and we see arousal. So we're only showing you one graph here, just kind of as a example. But what we see is that there are correlations to haptic density or haptic events and these other measures. There's some nuance there. You can overdo it, obviously. It has to be well designed and well engineered experience, but you can do it. And then we looked at recall, and we found that recall was improved. And this is not even, it's totally expected, right? If you're familiar with psychology, if you have a third stimulus that you can use to remind yourself of a memory, it's going to be certainly easier to remember. But it's a very nice story to be able to tell brands that haptic ads really do work. And then we asked people afterwards, and we asked people who both did see haptic ads and did not see haptic ads. And people who had seen the haptic version of the ad thought that the product was higher quality than its competitors at a higher rate. All right, so getting into kind of more like the design component of this. So you have all this, you have this framework, you have this data. How do we use it? So it's important that you understand that our approach is not to think of haptics as a derivative track. It's not something that is based on the audio the way that some other folks do it. We used to actually sell a product that did that, and it worked well. But what we find is that these measures associated with behavior and consumer behavior and advertising are more enhanced when the haptic track is precisely engineered. And brands also really kind of insist on this because they don't want unexpected things to happen during their very expensive ad buy. They don't want, certain people who have a low quality phone, all of a sudden the whole thing's buzzing and it's very unpleasant and they click away. Or they can't feel anything because the actuator is such that, that just has more inertia than was designed for in the conversion from audio to haptics, and now there's nothing to feel. Instead, we engineer a haptic track. So this is a screenshot from Pro Tools, which is a kind of an industry standard audio editor. But we can integrate with other tools also. It's just an example. And we have a demo in the other room of this, but here's your visual track, here's your audio track, and these are actually both haptic tracks, and you can have unlimited number of haptic tracks. You can then put them on a bus, a haptic bus, mix it down, and export a file that we encode for you, and then can be streamed onto platforms that that integrate with this system. So it's kind of an end-to-end technology. We make the tool, which is really important because creative professionals need tools that let them iterate and experiment without, complicated technological considerations, you could say. And so you need to kind of make people feel comfortable in that environment so that they can try new things, bring them for a creative review, then try something different, get things approved, and then finally encode it and know that low-quality phones, high-quality phones, mid-tier phones, even wearables, it's going to play back. It's going to feel basically like your design. The design intent is going to come through. So this is not your grandmother's basic buzz. And I put this in because there are some ads that have just like buzz the actuator. And that goes back to that first stage of the brain engagement of getting attention, right? It's just like it's a novelty. It's something that just like shakes you out of your complacency and makes you pay attention to the ad. But there's no story there. It's not really a story. Haptics are not part of that process. So that's not what we do. We craft stories. So how do you do this? Like, what do you use haptics for in a story? Well, the starting point is what you know. We already tell stories with the sense of touch. We use language in such a way that will direct you into thinking of opportunities for haptic designs. If you are talking about a company that wants to have a solid reputation, maybe it's like a financial institution, you're like, well, what haptics would go with a financial institution? Well, maybe a solid reputation, and you do something kind of impactful and implying the materiality of solidity, something like that, right? The personal touch, maybe you have visuals of human hands interacting with objects or other people, and you haptify that in a subtle, nuanced way that makes that whole image more powerful. So there's lots of different opportunities here. So as designers, this is what we're familiar with. We think about this all the time, and we're looking for these opportunities. And just a note on embodied cognition. It's important also to understand that what we think is grounded in what we feel and what we do. The mind-body duality theory has been disproven, right? So most people have not let go of that, but like if you're into the science of it, you realize that you can't really think independent of your body. And so this is one of the reasons I think also that haptic ads work well, because you are doing something physically to people's bodies and trying to get them to think of something and then behave in some certain way. And so it's a very direct path. So we saw the car ad earlier. That was an ad for a Peugeot that we did a while back. And the point of that ad was that you were supposed to feel like this roaring engine. So not only did we correlate haptics to the engine sound and the wind blowing as car passes, but on those close-ups of the hand shifting gears, we were putting these subtle clicks in, so it really felt like you could feel what the person was feeling shifting gears. So it added, yet another dimension beyond just rumble. I thought it was very effectively done. Okay, so getting more into the weeds, we don't have to get too detailed here, but I'll just give you kind of an overview. These are the 6 things that we think haptics can do. So if you're a tactile designer, you should know your craft. You can use our framework or some other one, it's fine. But you need to have some understanding of what are the different things haptics is achieving here. Why did we put that why did we make sure that first rev of that engine in the Peugeot ad was super strong, even stronger than the other haptics of the engine, even though that all the sound was the same level? Well, it's because we wanted to shift people's attention into the ad and bring them in. And then what about this shifting of gears? Like, is that really important? It's like, well, we actually found that it was kind of cool. Like, it was just fun. You're like, wow, I can actually feel the guy shifting. That's just fun. So it's a delightful moment. So if you can pepper in these little delightful moments that are unexpected, that works well. These other ones here, information flow. So this refers to like telling people information that they wouldn't otherwise have. So example would be like if you're designing a haptics for a wearable and the person is going to be running, but you want them to know how many messages they have as they're running. Well, they don't have a screen. Maybe they may not have audio. So now you're just kind of designing the flow of haptic information to make something clear to the user. Sensory immersion refers to making people feel like they have a sense of place, right? So we use this in VR all the time. If you're trying to create a sense of presence, you might use haptic effects to just kind of make a realistic representation of the world such that they feel like they're transported. Hedonics is a really interesting one that I think is maybe needs to be considered more as we design haptic experiences. So there are haptic sensations that just feel nice. Actually, there was Hong mentioned I think it was Hong mentioned the butterfly. That flutter effect, that kind of at low frequencies of vibration occurs. It actually occurs because there's a particular sensory channel that seems to respond to that range of frequencies that creates this pleasant flutter sensation. So it's like, well, that's good to know, right? Because if you want to make people have a pleasant sensation, you can kind of use those frequencies. You can also make things feel bad, and that's actually useful if you want to deter people from doing some error, right? Or get their attention. We were talking, somebody was earlier talking about transferring the control from an autonomous car to a driver. You might want something to feel quite irritating and bad until the driver pays attention. So you need to know how to kind of make those effects too. And then illusion is kind of a lot of times a distraction, actually. We kind of have to get past it with some of our clients when we're talking about haptic ads and how we can design haptics for a video, because it's kind of like what a lot of people who are less familiar with this whole process think, okay, well, haptics is just going to be an illusion. It's going to be like I can see the image and now I can feel exactly what it's like to do X, Y, Z. But it's actually, it does work, but there's a million technological problems with that. We've discussed them for 2 days. It's super hard. You would have to have a very high bandwidth, multimodal haptic display. And it's just like not necessarily needed when you have all these other design opportunities here. Although it's also very interesting. So here's another example of an ad that we did. Oh, is that not playing? Let me see. This is a video, but if it doesn't play, that's fine. Here we go. So this is a video in a web page, and the phone moves to kind of show you what it is like to feel this. So you're feeling the timpani drums, adding more and more drama. And then this tiny little like kada when it's a weird ad. But what I like about this though is that the haptics like complement. We have the beef. Okay, haptics complement the story because it's funny. Like there's like this big dramatic buildup, so the haptics are following the timpanis, and actually we've also used heartbeats before. So if we want to increase the kind of drama of a sequence or a montage, we might add a heartbeat effect that has nothing to do with the audio or the visuals, but it still creates this sense of excitement and anticipation. So that was done in this, and then he takes the shot and he hits a golf ball into a cup, and this like kind of puny haptic effect that goes along with that, I think sort of enhances the punchline of the ad. And this was also a part of a test that we did. I think this was with IPG Media Lab, and this is just one of the things that we found. We found many other things, but just that people felt more connected to the brand after being exposed to the haptic version of the ad. All right, so a few words on 360. Kind of has its own challenges. 360 video is considered to be one type of media, but really the way that people experience it is very different depending on how they're interacting with it, right? You could, most people, I think I read somewhere that vast majority of people are using their finger in a feed. They're just looking around like this. Some people are using magic window, these hand gestures, and then some people are putting it in a headset. So that's one video, but the haptics need to work for all of these things. And so we needed to have a framework within which to think about how haptics could be used in these experiences. It's a little bit different. So basically in the top left, if your gaze is not directed, if the director of the piece does not care where you're looking and it's just supposed to be kind of an ambient experience, then you would do an ambient haptic treatment. And the bottom left here, if you want to do an explicit haptic treatment instead of an ambient one, you might do things like let people know that certain parts of the video have further interactivity associated with them. So you might direct people's attention to a certain part of the video and make it a directed, like direct their bodies to interact with those components. On the top right, we thought these would be probably most useful for live events. You have, hundreds of people watching one thing. They're not really supposed to be looking around, but they're not necessarily feeling a specific event. They're just feeling the overall presence of being in the crowd. And then story points. So if it's really a narrative 360 video, then the director probably has an idea of like where they want you to be looking. And so you can kind of use haptics to get people to pay attention to the things that the director wants you to. So, okay, so beyond 360 video, VR. VR is almost, well, it's a harder problem, but it's also easier in terms of its design possibilities because there's almost so much built in already, like virtual reality. You're already thinking about that illusion one, or sensory immersion, right? There's an expectation that you're going to use haptics to bring people a simulated haptic experience of real life. And so these are, it's very early days, I would say. We are showing a haptic design tool next door for VR applications, and so we're just starting to play with this now. But these are kind of the three guidelines that I would give today. You still want to present those interactive affordances. You have brands that are trying to understand how do we advertise in VR. There are these new ad formats emerging, like Magic Room, where you are walking, you're in a world and you're presented with this opportunity to go through a portal and have a brand experience. And so presenting that to the user in a way that is, I would say, not interruptive and pleasing enough that they actually would want to continue the engagement with the brand is an important consideration. And then enable object interaction. This is huge, going back to that issue with bringing the sense of touch earlier in the purchase process. If you can enable haptic experiences of products and services, I suppose, of things that you're selling, you're going to get people to understand what you're selling better, possibly affect their behavior. And then importing experience from legacy media. So one of the things we're seeing in VR advertising is because VR ads are super expensive and companies already have like a bunch of video content, they're just like sticking it on the wall. So if that's the case, then maybe you want to use the same sorts of haptic treatments that you have been using for video as people interact with in VR video. Same goes for gaming. Like in gaming, there's kind of a well-developed haptic aesthetic for console gaming. You have the DualShock controllers with stereo vibe, one in each hand, and as a gamer, I can say that there are certain things that those haptics are just used for pretty consistently, and so you can also bring that learning into the VR space. So I kind of threw this in late in the process, but I find it an interesting framework too because I'm not saying this is right. I'm just kind of proposing it as one way of looking at the world. There are haptic display technologies that are all maturing at some rate, and they mature at the same time sometimes, and then you have a design opportunity there to kind of combine them and make a richer haptic experience. But there's also like this concept of a haptic sensor input. So as sensors, new sensors start to get incorporated into the devices and experiences that we have, some of them are just amenable to haptics because they're capturing data from body movement or data from manual interaction, things like that. And so as a designer, I find it pretty interesting to look for correlations. It's like, okay, well, pressure and force, that's kind of interesting. We saw that happen in mobile devices where high quality vibration, low frequency vibration, and pressure input sort of had this correlation, and there was a lot of design opportunity around that. So it's just something to keep in mind, I think, as we look at sensor technologies. We, as a team, we try to think about like how they correlate well to haptic output. All right, so in summary, so know the craft, like know what haptics are for. If Will was saying earlier, this nightmare scenario of having to like go into a piece of media and haptify it long after it's done. That I've been through that many times. But if you know your craft, you know what haptics is good for already, and you can kind of like fit it in pretty well. Know your audience, know how people's brains work, know what's going to interrupt them or what's going to make them feel pleasure or what's going to make them change their behavior based on brain science. And then know how touch is already used to tell stories, know how we use it in gaming, in language, and kind of incorporate all of that into your approach. So thanks very much. If you want to go see more haptic video ads, you can go on Google Play and download this public app where we post some of our video content. It's called Content Portal. Feel free to take a picture. I can help you after this session. There's new content being added all the time, so you can kind of like, if you watch a bunch of videos, you'll start to understand maybe a little bit better some of these design principles. So thanks a lot.
So a quick question for you. As you work with a lot of these different brands, we find, and we've seen that a lot of brands have a sort of ownership over the products that they make and kind of want to either have a ownership over the haptic of their product. Just like a company, say like Harley Davidson, can trademark the sound of their motorcycle or patent it. We see it a lot with products that we quantify, but do you think that brands will get into sort of like haptic ownership?
I do, actually. I just read something this morning that Visa is making a branded haptic pattern for a completed transaction. I literally just read that like 2 hours ago. So yes, I think that's important. And also it's important to think of brands already have a haptic component. Like we were talking earlier about the BMW slamming car door. That's like they spend a lot of time and money to get that right. And to be able to bring that into an ad, I think is tremendously valuable for them. It extends the value of that entire endeavor, right? So yes, absolutely.
So good talk. I really like your graphics. You're good at that. So a lot of these, it's like a passive haptics, right? Like you're feeling the engine that you don't have control over. And you know where I'm going with this, but from the active level, like being able to interact with something, like what would you expect from an advertising perspective of, active haptics, like reach out and touch something and feel that and be more connected and interacted?
Yeah, I think the two things come to mind. One is obviously product interaction. Again, like getting people to touch a product, getting people to put a product in a physical shopping cart makes them more likely to purchase it. So anything that will make them more likely to engage with their bodies with a product is going to make them more likely to purchase. So that's huge. The other thing is, frankly, like a lot of this viral marketing is just about entertaining people, just about either shocking them or doing something fun. And you can do a lot of unexpected, weird stuff with haptics that I think, companies, it resonates with them because they're like, oh, people are totally going to share this. We see that in the social space as well. We work in the social space. We create haptic stickers and haptic virtual gifts for live streaming and things like that. And so that whole just like entertainment value is there too.
Let's take